get going. Right, settle myself down. So, correct notes in order. So for those of you who weren't in the plenary that started us off this morning, my name is Rachel Trigg and I'm the Head of Research Program at AHURI. I'm delighted to welcome you to this session, partly because it's a subject very near and dear to my heart and some recent work that I've been doing, and partly because we have 4 truly excellent speakers looking at very different projects at many different parts of the country, so there will be some really good comparisons and contrasts going on, as well as lots of, I think, potentially patterns that come out of what we hear today. So thank you in advance to our speakers. You can see I had about a 3-minute break between getting here. Thank you, Andrew. So I disclose that I was born and raised in Noongar land earlier today, and I'd again like to acknowledge that for this session we are also convening on the land of the Noongar Whadjuk Whadjuk. I pay my respects to elders and to all First Nations people who are joining us with this session and throughout the conference more broadly. I'd also like to, particularly for this session, but of course for many others as well, to acknowledge people who are joining us in this session with lived experience. For when we're looking at social housing renewal, people with lived experience of social housing, of renewal processes, of homelessness and vulnerable housing are critical to making sure that we I was going to say get this right. I don't know if one can ever get these things right, but can certainly do it in a much more trauma-informed, responsive, careful way. So thank you for bringing your voices and expertise to this discussion. So in terms of how we're going to run the session today, we've been quite aspirational. We've got 4 speakers, all with amazing insights. So I want to make sure that we have the ability to do them all their justice. But we're going to have 2 presentations first. So we're going to hear from Mark and David. We're going to hear from Mark and David first. And the rationale behind that is that we've got one presentation from Western Australia, one from Victoria, from Melbourne and Victoria, and they both centre around a land use. Lease model, thank you. You can tell my brain is still evaporating after the earlier session. A lease model of renewal. So they've got some similarities in that regard. They also have some similarities in that we've got 2 architects speaking first. So I'm going to have a couple of quick questions then. So I might let you know in advance. I was going to maybe be greedy and snuff all those questions myself, but I think I'm in a more generous mood. So I'll just let you know now that we'll have just a couple of quick questions to start with for the first 2 speakers, and then we will move into our second 2 speakers and open up to a broader panel discussion. But I have neglected a key thing, which of course is to introduce our speakers, who we're very lucky to have with us. So to start with, we have Mark Black, who is a principal and studio leader at Architectus here in Perth. We also have David Islip, who's the Principal Advisor in Architecture and Urban Design at the Office of the Victorian Government Architect, which goes by the easy to roll off the tongue acronym of OVGA. We then, going up north, have Stephen Land, who is the Chief Investment Officer at the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility. So I think this is the first time we've heard from the Northern Australian Infrastructure Facility here at this conference. So looking forward to getting that perspective. And then Andrew McAnulty here. McAnulty. I've been saying your name wrongly, David. Andrew, for 10 years or so. I do apologise. Goodness. Who is, as we know, the CEO of Wentworth, one of Australia's largest community housing providers, and also kindly a conference sponsor. So we're packing a lot in to this session just to keep you energised as we draw to the end of the conclusion. And so I'm now going to throw straight to Mark to jump into lessons from the social renewal.
Lovely, thank you, Rachel. So as Rachel has introduced, my name is Mark Black. I'm a principal and architect and the studio leader of Architectus here in our Perth studio. And I'm going to talk to you about a recent project, a current project rather, which is Smith Street, which is a partnership where we were kindly invited by Tetris Capital and Community Housing Limited to partner with the first pilot project of ground lease model here in Western Australia. So before I begin, I'd like to follow Rachel in acknowledging the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land, the Noongar Budja, that we meet on today, and acknowledge their spiritual and cultural connection to land. So without further ado, Architectus, we're a national design business. We have got presence in all major centres with the exception of Darwin at the moment, and indeed 3 studios in New Zealand. A little bit of context in terms of what we do. We work across multiple disciplines, but we do focus in living, and that is affectionately everything with a bed in it that's not a clinical or a health facility, including social and affordable. This is a project that we were delighted to deliver with a wonderful organisation called RUA. It's the RUA Centre for Women and Babies here in Perth in Northbridge, whereby they combine 13 very flexible, agile residential units that are interconnected. And they're housed within a mixed-use building which has got a suite, an array of support services for women and children who are in a transitional phase of recovering and escaping domestic violence. Context for this one, completely different end of the scale, on the very northern fringes of Fremantle, 35k south of here. We worked with a private developer, Serona Urban, to deliver 215 focused on key worker housing, so a build-to-rent type product that we received planning approval for late last year, and very much brought the idea of connecting with park, connecting with garden, and connecting with outside amenity as part of that development. And our colleagues over east in Victoria, and David may speak to this also separately, in Markham as part of the Victorian government's rollout of social and affordable housing. We similarly worked around this idea of internal facing and external facing quality, and that is the external facing being landscape based, being community based, being a broader direct connection to community, and then internally looking at quality of material, robustness and nature, and then I guess addressing the materials in the external of the building to be sensitive to the broader community that they're part of in architectural sense, and looking towards the future of the robust nature of materials needed when you're looking at a ground lease model. So specifically Smith Street, as I mentioned, we were part of one of the proponents invited by Tetris and Community Housing Limited to participate in what was originally a 2-stage procurement process led by Department of Communities at the time, and successfully got through that and then into a delivery process, which is a 3-step process. Because of the nature of the site, demolition and preparation of site, stage 1, construction of development, stage 2, which has recently commenced in August with the appointment of the builder, and the ground lease model then managed and delivered, operated by Community Housing Limited over the approximately 50-year tenure of the project. So a very quick snapshot of the lifeline from that original pilot BTR advice that came out in Feb 2022, proponent invitation, selection and contract right through to December 23. At that point, the work really began for us as consultants and designers into the process of delivering against the working brief, working very carefully and collaboratively with community housing, with Tetris, with the City of Vic Park, the local government authority, and more broadly with the Department of Communities, and indeed the planning, the local planning and the state planning framework. So we went through a series of state design review panels as the working brief evolved, and happy to say construction, as I mentioned, has begun in August. The project itself is 109 dwellings, 78 public or social housing units within that, 22 affordable, and then 9 specialist disability accessible units of a variety of types. I mean, broadly in terms of mix, they're 60% 1 beds, 40% 2 beds, and then a variety of typologies within the SDA units as well. The site is Highgate, which is interestingly one of the smallest local authority areas in the proximity to the Perth CBD. It's 2 kilometres northeast in the northeastern corridor from Perth CBD. The site itself was host to what was a fairly tired and dilapidated 1960s social housing project in Stirling Towers. Due diligence and analysis of this very early in the piece came to the conclusion that it was a bigger obstacle than it was an advantage to retaining this asset in terms of what it is, where it is in the community, and in terms of its built form, and indeed it was end of life as a piece of construction. The broad framework, without harping on this, the three sketches there on the left identifies we're pretty much in a 3-story area for approved development or supported development. The yellow and the green in the central diagram talk to the yellow being the vibrant heart of this suburb, being Beaufort Street, and then the green being the traffic, the vehicular key north-south link through Highgate. And interestingly, that's where a lot of the density of this suburb is developing appropriately along those two corridors. And then you can see the bright green on the very right-hand side being a generous amount of public reserve amenity through the suburb. So some really good assets within this suburb, so a very strategically selected site, no doubt, for this first endeavour. As I touched on before, Stirling Towers really was an outlier. What we've done here is just identified and highlighted any of the density, medium to higher density developments in this area. It's predominantly a single double-storey development, although there is a high portion of apartments and flats within this suburb. You can see the density of the suburb is not gathered in one individual place, and the 13 stories of Stirling Towers certainly was the outlier in terms of scale. And then some of the immediate kind of micro environment there, we've got back gardens in single-storey houses which are backing onto our site, and we've got heritage building in near close proximity with a 13-storey existing tower that we propose to remove. So some design principles we embedded in that were, a real sense of ownership, permeability and integration. I've talked to the open spaces, but certainly a centralised garden and making those safe, and a generous connection to nature. Obviously reducing the scale of the development, we wanted to really preserve some of the views across the development, but then we wanted to really focus a garden heart to this community, to this new community. So left to right, we looked at the existing scale and proportion of those buildings as being out of kilter with the broad immediate community, and then we reshaped them right over to the left, where we got to a 4-storey, 3-storey, effectively to street, so stepped back to street to really fit in terms of scale and sense of place with the broader community. And there at the bottom of the page, you can see how that works from right to left, where we've got a 4-storey, but the 4th storey stepped back to create a communal garden on the roof, and then using the natural contour of the site, working through to a 3-storey onto Stirling Street, which is at the western end of the site. So really important for us to focus on, particularly with the inclusion of the 9 SDA units, was this connection with ground and connection with street. So you can see the sense of scale of this development coming from a 12, 13-storey tower block to a 3-storey development, which takes up the entire site. But then we've stepped back that 4th storey to create that communal garden on the roof. And just a quick look at the plans. We've arranged so the yellow are your typical single and double units, and then the other colours identifying the different typologies of SDA units that we embedded into that, with a variation of connection to private garden along the north, and then obviously connection to that central communal garden at grade through the south. And then arrange the building in 3 recognisably individual blocks connected by very open, well-lit, airy vertical connection, and then lifts either end for both redundancy and both equality of access. So part of that, I guess, broad brush review of architecture, a big part of this for us was, and I spoke to some of my learned colleagues earlier, but this is beginning a design process whereby what is the building going to be like, what is the precinct going to be like in 50 years' time, as the starting conversation is a really important part from a design consideration and for the collaborative team. So connection to genuine flourishing landscape spaces that can mature with the development so that in 50 years they will be much better than day one. But then the material of the building, both internally and externally, looking at external, natural and solid materials with permanency. So we're talking about natural brick, exposed concrete in limited exposure, but in terms of robustness, and bringing some of those solid materials right throughout the building, and then indeed working very carefully with our landscape architects to look at how we can get that conversation between the semi-open spaces, which are the vertical circulation connections between the dwelling blocks, and then the celebrated courtyard. And then even in the top right-hand corner here, we identified a beautiful mature lemon-scented gum that we worked around to retain, but then enveloped the idea of a community garden, a community library into that retained tree for external and internal benefit to the residents. And then worked on this sense of ownership and the idea that in the future that the landscape will mature, the landscape will develop, and then can we work into the facade of the building actual working planter boxes that can then evolve with the community, and that we're looking at the proximity and the orientation of there, that they're genuinely positioned so that we can get the benefit of the longevity of the project itself. So I guess in essence, from a design perspective, the key thing for us was that change in brief, that we're looking at a ground lease model that really is taking a close lens on where this asset's going to be in 50 years and what value it is. The land will be there, the land value will be embedded, and of course the land value will increase. However, the asset value we perceive to be something that can grow, being well maintained, which is obviously the structure of the deal, but then the architecture and the landscape architecture and indeed the interior design can contribute to that narrative. With that, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I have to confess that I'm going to be looking at that project with a greater than typical degree of interest, because I actually used to live on Smith Street in Highgate. So one of those orange or yellow blobs on the three-dimensional plan where the high-density units were in Highgate was my home some years ago.
Well, the shadow of the Sterling Towers is gone.
I'm sure the person who now lives in that flat will be pleased to hear it. So thank you, Mark. And I guess by way of contextualisation for our next speaker too, as far as I'm aware, the project that Mark was speaking to is the first ground lease model here in Perth, or in fact in Western Australia, whereas, segue to David Islip, Victoria is well progressed with many ground lease models, both completed and underway. So David, hand over to you.
Thank you, and good morning everyone. The elevators have become a new arena of confrontation. The corridors are jungle. This is a quote from J.G. Ballard's book, High Rise. Ballard's dystopian novel and later the film remind us that spatial design is never neutral. Even everyday elements like corridors or elevators can shape human behaviour, reinforcing isolation, hierarchy and conflict. When spatial systems don't support social cohesion, they can intensify division. And Ballard's fiction becomes a cautionary tale for us that space organises not just movement, but also power, emotion, and social order. If design is to have a real role in housing, it needs to be valued. Good design isn't an optional extra. It's not about being avant-garde, and it's not about adding gold plating. And in our office, we have to argue this over and over again. And as architecture reflects its time, so governments are remembered for their architectural legacies. We know that good design doesn't just happen by accident. It depends on design teams being open to advice and independent design review. And much of our work as architects is invisible. We're resolving conflicts, protecting design intent, shaping decisions before anything is even built. We're visible in the room, but the work that safeguards good design often happens behind the scenes, constrained by the bubble of probity. And that's why receptiveness to our guidance is critical for long-term success. And often our greatest hurdle is within government itself. You can't retrospectively add sunlight to apartments. It has to be designed in. And this is the project Mark was talking about in Markham Avenue in Victoria by Architectus. It has to be designed in from the start, and governments need both capability and capacity to create a culture of good design. So my first point is this, that design matters in the long term. The ground lease model, GLM, is a public-private partnership in effect, and it's an approach that's been used in Victoria. I worked on the very first PPP, which was the County Court of Victoria, probably over 25 years ago. And they can be a good model, but there are traps and pitfalls along the way. So here, with the ground lease model, public land is leased by Homes Victoria to a private consortium that finances, designs, and constructs and maintains new housing. A community housing provider comes in to help with the management for the site, and it's for a period of 40 years, before returning the land and the dwellings back to the state. Ground Lease Model 1 delivered 1,100 new homes across Flemington, Brighton and Paran. But design procurement is not like buying paper clips for the office. It's complex, and as John Denton, the former government architect of Victoria, put it, with PPPs, public-private partnerships, you have to accept what you're offered, not what you've thoughtfully decided you need. At Bain Street in Paran, which was the part of Ground Lease Model 1, there's 120 outdated social homes that were demolished and replaced by 434 new homes, which included 228 social and 206 market rentals. That's a density of 348 dwellings per hectare, which is over 20 times the Melbourne average. But here's the issue. In this procurement model, money tends to outweigh design quality. And of the 3 bids, this wasn't necessarily the best design. But that said, our role was to be in the room, to sit at the table and to help improve it and to support the architects in doing that, wherever we could. We introduced 13 design principles into the bid documents. We created a design quality team of architects, urban designers and landscape architects. Together, we held 40 interactive tender workshops that were draining and exhausting, reviewing 12 different design schemes. We also advocated for independent post-occupancy evaluations to ensure that the learnings continue after completion. So what were the benefits? Well, we reduced multiple car park entries down to 1, improving safety and street quality. We retained more trees and strengthened links to adjacent community spaces. We broke up the monolithic building massing to improve light, air and permeability. And we also advocated for stronger solar control to the west. And so there were lessons that were learned out of this process. We learned that a strong public sector comparator, or what's known as the reference design, is vital because it sets the benchmark around innovation. We also learned to protect amenity and design, especially in the common areas and also the landscape. Further, we learnt that there's a need to lock in standards for light, ventilation and internal amenity early in the process. We also looked at issues surrounding the kitchen bench space, which in some communities is never big enough. We looked at lighting and also electrical provision. And so overall, we aim to resolve design issues before each milestone, to manage risk and uncertainty long before there was contract close. Another project was New Street Brighton as part of GLM1, where 127 outdated homes were replaced with 291 new dwellings, including 151 social and 140 market rentals. 5% of those social homes were designed for accessibility. And so that was about a 19% uplift in social housing, 10 kilometres from Melbourne CBD, with a density of 209 dwellings per hectare. That is about 14 times the city average. The benefits of this were advocacy and outcomes that reflected consolidated basement entries once again, reducing car dominance and protecting public realm. Here we ensured tenure equity, so indistinguishable between social and market housing. We also improved circulation areas and transparency in stairwells to enhance safety and community. We linked open space into the existing street network, reinforced through landscape design. And we embedded all the services that we're going to be sticking up on the roof within the roof itself, improving visual amenity. And finally, we refined materials and finishes for durability and longevity. This project would look very different if we hadn't have been in the room. And that's the value of design advocacy. Now under construction is Ground Lease Model 2. Now this is delivering 1,370 new homes across 4 sites in South Yarra, Paran, Port Melbourne and Hampton East. They will replace around 500 existing dwellings, and it includes social, affordable, disability and market rental homes. But the key question remains, how do we create a true design culture, especially within government? Since the closure of the Public Works Department in the 1980s, government design capability has significantly weakened. Public sector architects now play a critical role, to be frank and fearless, in advocating for the public interest. However, both public and private architects face intense cost-cutting pressures. And when architects end up in a PPP model or a ground lease model, their voice can often be smothered. And so this makes design advocacy essential, to show why design quality actually matters. Design delivers value when there's a strong master plan in place that supports long-term success. Efficient layouts that improve usability, orientation that ensures sunlight, comfort and health, and material choices that are assessed over their full life cycle to save money, especially when the consortia must hand back the buildings as new after 40 years. So to close, there's 3 key takeaways I'd like to leave with you today. Commit to a design-led housing program for long-term value. Secondly, understand that good design is not gold plating, it's livability. And third, manage the risks of the ground lease model through informed, design-led procurement. Design advocacy isn't just about buildings. It's about shaping the systems that deliver those buildings, the procurement, the partnerships, and the public culture that make good housing possible. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. You can see why we were very pleased by the speaker, the way in which the balance of different perspectives might play out on this panel, because we've got the Western Australian perspective from a recent new model that's just beginning in Western Australia, And then on the other side of the country, we've got the Victorian model that is, already having tenants and residents in one development, and a lot more that's being completed at the moment. So as promised, I'm not going to be selfish with the question time. We're going to open up for just a couple of questions now, so do bear with me if you have questions for Mark and David that we don't get to now. There will be further time for questions for them, but we're just going to have a moment to, move a bit differently in our seat and to hear from you, from other experts that we have with us today. So I'm going to open it up to just probably 2 questions, and then we'll hear from Stephen and Andrew, and then we'll have some broader discussion. So questions, one up the back here was the first one that popped to my eye. Yep.
Thank you so much. I keep it really short, so I'll come straight to the point. How do you measure an increase in livability through design?
Excellent. So
I'm happy to kick that off. Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
It's a really good question, because often you're in the room with a bunch of economists, or you're dealing with the financiers to do with that ground lease model, and it's a different language completely. And so we've learnt in our office the importance of creating the evidence base that sits behind that, and we created a document called The Case for Good Design. And it goes through, and it's a collection of different typologies, so housing, education, health, and it talks to where's the evidence base that says that more sunlight will reduce depression, or where's the evidence to say that better sustainability levels and benchmarks like Green Star are going to improve health outcomes. And so an example of that was that, if you compare Australia's housing, it's not that great. And when it was compared to Sweden, there was an increased level of deaths occurring because of poor climate control, like in winter, in Australia compared to Sweden. In fact, it was double what Sweden's got, even though Sweden's climate is a lot different. And so that evidence base, which says it's important that we actually have a really good NCC, that we have good sustainability benchmarks, that NATAS works properly, because it's in the interest of people's long-term health. So we've got that evidence base there. It's on our website, and I encourage you to have a look at it.
Just going to ask if that was a public document,
yeah,
so people can have a look at some of the ways in which the OVGA or OGVA is measuring those factors around neighbourhood ability. Mark, did you have any thoughts from your work either on the Highgate site or elsewhere in your practice?
Well, I think more generally, because obviously it's early days with the Highgate project, but interesting cross-reference, and without being cynical in terms of the metrics that don't exist for technically measuring, specifically to the question, the livability, the evidence-based design, and the author of which it escapes me now, but I know it's very much prevalent in hospital design, and it was a large subject for discussion in Western Australia around the Fiona Stanley Hospital development more than a decade ago now, and the evidence was pretty hard and fast that access to natural light, access to control of your environment, and views to the natural environment actually allow people to heal quicker. So the cynical side of the comment, I guess, is this evidence was drafted and became viable from a commercial hospital services perspective. The same applies to creating livable communities, livable dwellings, and livable homes. That if one can recover, and the evidence is in, one can recover in an environment with natural light, control of one's environment, and access to the natural environment, that it makes perfect sense that the same data or the same measure would apply to livability.
Thank you, and thank you for one of the most succinct and to the point questions I've heard thus far. Thanks very much. We're going to go from the back to the front of the room here. So the gentleman in the brown coat had a question before.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Brad Braithwaite from Hume Community Housing in New South Wales. Thank you, Mark and David, for wonderful examples of social housing renewal done well, and particularly mixed tenure redevelopment, which is just great to see. My question relates to something that might, I'm not sure if it'll be controversial or triggering for you both, but I want to talk about from my home state and the Planning Minister's attempt to come back to the world of pattern books. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on pattern books in general, and good, bad and the ugly, and what they might do for us in this space of social housing and social housing renewal, and how could they be used well in our space.
Thank you. And before we have Mark and David dive into that one, I'll just give a tiny bit of context for those of you who aren't New South Wales based. The Office of the Government Architect in New South Wales has publicly released a pattern book, so a series of designs that can be used almost free of charge. I think they're $1, you pay $1, and you can get architectural designs for, I don't think it's specifically social housing or social housing renewal, but for good quality design for housing in general.
In fact, yeah, very correct. In fact, one of the issues is those of us who look at it for social and affordable housing say, oh, if they were designed with our needs in mind, they might have been cheaper to implement as designs as well. So
that might also almost be leading the witnesses here in terms of perspectives. That's okay. Yeah. So I might throw Mark to you to think about pattern book.
Asking two architects, is there a scenario where architects shouldn't be involved? Is, I dare say, a controversial question. I would strongly advocate for site, for context. You might tell by my accent, I grew up quite a while from here, but if I got on a plane and stayed on the plane for 4.5 hours, I think I would have got from Dublin to Turkey, whereas we're talking about New South Wales and Perth being a similar journey. So I will advocate for site, for context, for climate, and for individual advocacy around a working brief every time. Pattern books, cookie cutter, one size fits all is a very dangerous direction to go in when individual needs and site conditions are so diverse. How do you get in an SEA context, how do you get a pattern book for abilities or disabilities, as one example? So a very cautionary note. What I would say on the positive side, if I can be positive for a moment, I think it's not necessarily about the next steps in pattern book designing. I think the biggest challenge is facing all of us in this room in terms of delivering more homes is construction. So I think modular, prefabrication, really intelligent methods of construction as something that's replicatable, that's something that can be delivered across all states, is something that we should invest a little bit more time and energy in.
Thank you. David?
Look, we're a supporter of that as a concept. I think you have to have a number of different tools in the kit to actually make housing, happen for us. I mean, we're always talking about, supply, but it's also the demand. And why do we have the demand, and what are the problems inherent in that? So our office put together a competition. We had open competition, which was to come up with individual schemes, and so there were 4 kind of pattern books that we came up with for different sites. They were adaptable, so that was supported, but the idea was to streamline the planning process, because that's often perceived to be a significant hurdle, land holding costs and all of that. So if you can get on site and deliver quicker, I mean, in 2021, 22, like, cost of construction went through the roof, like in the order of 20% plus. So in that period, if you'd managed to get a good start, you're in a good space. But if you hadn't, it's tricky. So we're a strong supporter of it. The challenge is when government doesn't commit to actually building some of them as a template, like take the template, build it. Yep. And we wish Homes Victoria had done that, because if people can touch and feel, suddenly it all makes sense to them. And that's a real positive. So the Planning Minister in Victoria was a strong supporter of the concept. I know New South Wales have come up with theirs, and we wish them well, and we hope they do get them built. But until you can touch and feel, it's really hard to kind of get behind it as a concept, because people just don't understand until they do that.
Yeah.
And just to get some discussion flowing, Andrew's going to join us now, just to mix things up a bit and keep things moving.
great question. I think I was just going to observe that Rob Stokes, who's here in a non-government capacity now, used to be the planning minister in New South Wales. And I remember going to a brilliant series of developments in Adelaide when I was down there. And there was a lot of zero lot developments and townhouses and all sorts of really great innovative designs and low cost to build solutions. And I remember forwarding them through to Rob and then having a discussion. And I prefaced it by saying none of these are approvable in New South Wales. So I think one of the things where pattern books are a good idea, they set out the principle of what could be good design, and they change the narrative about what could be designed and what could be built, and then it allows for those to be implemented with a bespoke bit of architecture to suit the site. But I think there's a lot of innovation that's just looks brilliant in different states, but you can't build it because it's not permissible. So I think it helps change the narrative.
Okay, before we go too far into the woes of the New South Wales planning system, of which I think there could be a special club formed here, we will hear from Stephen. And I know that there were a couple of other hands that had questions before, so we will have an opportunity for further questions, so you won't miss out. So we've been west, we've been east, and now we're going to go north.
Great, thank you, and thank you very much for having me this morning. It's great to be here. So I'm from the Northern Australia Infrastructure Facility. We're a government financier set up in 2016 really to address issues in Northern Australia. For those who aren't very good at trivia, if you cut the country in half sort of across the middle, so we go basically from Carnarvon on the west coast through all of the Northern Territory to Gladstone on the east coast. Above that line's only 5% of the population of Australia, so it's very thinly populated. It's got bad climate, poor logistics. It's just a very difficult place to do business and an expensive place to do business. So we were set up really to address a funding gap in the market. The commercial bank market doesn't like Northern Australia, and particularly when it comes to things like infrastructure, the increased cost of setting up there are such that without some level of additional support, it's very hard to get things built.
And Stephen, I'm just going to ask if you could move the mic a tiny bit closer. That would be grand. Thank you.
There we go. So we've got two key drivers. First of all, is driving economic development in Northern Australia. The second one is population growth. So the whole housing sector really comes at the centre of that. We've got two key differentiators from other financiers. One's around public benefit. So all of our projects need to have a public benefit assessment, really to make sure that the benefits of the project are flowing more broadly than just to developers. And secondly, around Indigenous outcomes. So Northern Australia's got a much higher Indigenous population by percentages than the South. So all of our projects need to have a program really to engage with traditional owners to provide, whether it's jobs, training, procurement from Indigenous-owned businesses, etc. Big issue in Northern Australia is around risk. As I said, the commercial bank market is reticent to lend in Northern Australia. And also investors find it difficult to invest up there, and we'll talk about that in a minute, just around some of the different dynamics across the north versus southern Australia. But as a result, we were set up really to de-risk projects, so that we take on a higher risk piece of the capital stack to allow other investors, whether that's debt investors or equity investors, to make projects happen. And to do that, we offer concessions. So those concessions can be around tenor, they can be around structural features, so capitalising interest or deferring amortisation, and also some pricing concessions if required to make projects happen. Just to give you a quick snapshot of the scale of NAIF, at the moment we have $7 billion in funding. Of that, we've committed around $4.5 billion to projects across the north, and we are sector agnostic, so we're not just looking at housing projects, we're looking at mining, agriculture, sort of classic infrastructure, airports. So we've got a whole range of projects in our portfolio. As I said, we focus really on jobs and Indigenous outcomes, and we're a big part of the government's 20-year strategy around Northern Australia. So in relation to housing projects, just really running through these, we've got one project that's operational that we've worked on, which is JCU, one that's in financial close, the Cairns Housing project, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail later, because I think it's a really good example of how many stakeholders can come together to make a project happen. We're looking at a couple of other housing projects, one in Northern Territory and one in Queensland. Got a big pipeline of projects. Since we closed the Cairns Housing project, we've had a much greater interest from investors around projects they're looking to develop across Northern Australia and how we can help. And as I said, we refocus on doing more in that remote space. So the capital cities tend not to be an area we focus in, it's more remote areas. So getting onto the community housing project in Cairns, it's 490 dwellings. Of those, there's 245 are social housing, 223 are affordable, and there's 22 disability dwellings. The one thing that makes it really different to a lot of projects is it's actually modular construction. So I think, as Mark and David mentioned, modular construction is somewhere that we see this as being really important in the north around, because of issues around speed, just the availability of trades, and the ability to actually get things mobilised fast. With the wet season, construction periods are often shortened annually, so being able to get things done on an accelerated basis is really important. Importantly, across most of the region we operate, things have to be cyclone rated, so the cost of regular construction is high. If you look up on the north coast, a 3-bedroom house is about $1 million to build, and one of the big issues facing developers up there is that it costs more to build than it's ultimately worth. So used a recent example in Mackay, it's about $450,000 to build a townhouse there. You've got to then buy the land on top of that, and when you've finished it, it's probably only worth close to $375,000 to $400,000. So there's this big issue around what's the appraised value of that house when it's completed, and therefore that really limits how much funding's available for it. So in relation to the Cairns Housing Project, it came together through a lot of stakeholders, putting their collective thoughts together. It's developed by Tetris Capital, so the same project as Smith Street, and also CHL is effectively the operator of the project. In order to get the project running, though, everyone had to give a bit. So Tetris's return on that was lower than they would normally see in Southern Australia. CHL provided a long-term wrap on the maintenance, so they've actually got a fixed price indexed maintenance agreement to cover all of the maintenance, as well as managing the tenants. So it's not sort of market linked as it would be elsewhere. The local council also contributed by removing the infrastructure fees that they would normally charge, and there was a concession on the acquisition of the land. So it's actually on an old drive-in theatre site just outside of the main CBD in Queensland. So that was the base for it. It's being built as a modular project, so Modscape in Victoria is the builder. FCC is a big Spanish contractor, is wrapping that risk. And so the panels are then transported from Victoria to southern Queensland, assembled into modules, and then trucked up to Northern Australia and craned on site. So Northern Australia has a real shortage of trades. There's a lot of mining up there that pays very well on very attractive terms. So one of the key drivers of this sort of modular construction was reducing the number of trades on site. So there's only about 6 to 10 people on site at any one time, putting together 490 dwellings. So it just shows you how modular construction can really speed up the construction of projects, but also reduce the number of trades and therefore the overall cost. So as you can see from the numbers, we're putting a loan in there of up to $140 million, and that's pretty concessional, but generating a lot of public benefit. And that's the quantified public benefit. It doesn't take into account the much more subjective features around having safe weatherproof dwellings, etc., for people to live in. We also did James Cook University. It's slightly different, but again, it was one of those projects where having some concessional financing and structural features really helped to deliver the project. So I think, in terms of how we see Northern Australia, it's very much a distillation of the issues facing the country as a whole. It's got, difficulty in labour, difficult climatic conditions, difficult insurance, which is a big one in Northern Australia. Getting insurance is incredibly difficult and expensive, and oftentimes underinsured, and that's another area that we sort of come in and help fill that gap, so we can help support projects through that. So in terms of what we can do in the sector, we only operate in Northern Australia, so we've got a defined line under our mandate. We do loans. They're not grants. We don't do equity. So ultimately we have to be able to demonstrate to our board that we can get the loans repaid. But in order to do so, we can take very concessional terms of oftentimes very long-dated loans. So on the Cairns Housing Project, it's a 20-year loan, which is way in excess of what you would normally see from a commercial financier. We act as a gap financier, so we can't displace the commercial market. We're really there to augment them and help de-risk the projects, to help crowd those private sector investors in. And our, as I said, our project, our focus is really around public benefit and job creation in Northern Australia. So I don't need to read those all out for you, but really it's around, we work the other opposite way to most financiers. So what we do is we look at what conditions need to be present for a project to be successful and move forward. And then we try and help fill those conditions. So people often ask, what interest rate do you charge? Well, it depends on the project. How long do you lend for? It depends on the project. So we're extremely flexible in that respect. It's all around delivering that ultimate public benefit and the Indigenous outcomes. So if you want to talk to us, you can get on our website. We've got a very fulsome website around what we can do. But our project structure is very similar to what the commercial bank market would do. We like to engage with people, understand what they're doing, and then we go through a couple of gating exercises. We're what they call a corporate Commonwealth entity, so we're not the public service, but we're also not the private sector. We sit in this sort of in-between ground, so we have an independent board who actually ultimately make all of our decisions. And so, we need to make sure that they're comfortable with the way the project's moving forward. We diligence it just like you would normally see on a commercial project, and we support proponents through that. And I think it's one thing that we want to reinforce is we want the projects to move forward, so we're prepared to make a lot of concessions rather than you need to fit in with what we can do. So look, that's it in general, but I think the things that Mark and David mentioned around design, and I guess where the bean, well, I'm sort of the bean counter guy. Ultimately, some of this comes down to government policy, and I think that's one area where it is definitely changing. But as you'll see from things like the Housing Australia Fund, it's all about dollars per dwelling. At the moment, there's not really a lot of contemplation about what's good value for money in the sense of amenity delivered. It's all about how many dwellings do we get for how much money. So I think that things like modular construction can really change that dynamic if it's taken on a widespread basis. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. And I'm sure you will have questions for Stephen, but we'll hold them over to after we've heard from our fourth and final speaker. So you can see we're starting to build pictures and perspectives here. We've been west, we've been south, we've been north, we're about to go east. We've heard from a private sector architect working on public sector programs and projects. We've heard from public sector, government sector architect. We've heard from the self-described bean counter and thought about things from the infrastructure perspective and in Northern Australia. And so now we hear from the community housing perspective. So Andrew, take us away.
Thank you. I'd like to just begin by paying my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to pay my respects to everyone in the room, the diverse backgrounds and experiences you've got. I see, local government, state government, federal government representatives, community housing providers, people with lived experience, consultants and experts of various natures. When I think about the community housing sector and our organisations, the one that I'm proud enough to lead, I think there's two words that come to mind in terms of our business and our sector. The first one's people. We're not really a housing business, we're a people business. And as part of being a people business, I think the sector really looks at legacy outcomes. So I think we look at what can we achieve, and when you look at 20 years ago, or Link Wentworth is in our 41st year, and we started like every community housing organisation with 2 or 3 homes, and then that changed over time with more. But it's always been about people, and it's been about legacy. So one of the things when we get involved in structures and talks around structures, and even the ground lease model, one of the things I really implore people to think about is how do we contain some of that value in the community housing sector, because the legacy is a virtuous cycle of if it works better, the money doesn't leak outside the sector, it just gets recycled in more housing and more services for people in need. That's one of the big things we need to advocate for, not be complicated, and by its very nature,
and the legacy impact. We are interested in the highest quality design. We're interested in the lowest maintenance cost, life cycle costings. We're interested in cost in use for our tenants. We're interested in fuel poverty. So we're interested in making sure that not just the tenant can afford the rent, but they can afford the electricity bill. So one of the big things I get from this conference and the energy I'm getting from it is we do need to think more about the by whom as well, who delivers, and actually not be scared, as one of the speakers said the other day, that there should be a profit because people don't do things without a profit. But wouldn't it be good if we could recycle that profit in a not-for-profit, which actually recycles that surplus into more housing outcomes and services? This picture, and people are very important to me. I've got less people pictures in this pack than usual, but this is Larissa with Lulu. Larissa, again, I would regard Larissa as a friend of mine. I've known her for at least 5 years, probably closer to 10. She's on our tenant advisory group, and she gives her time to let us know her views about what we're doing well, and importantly, what we're not doing well. And her dog Larissa, her dog Lulu, is her support dog. And a couple of years ago, Larissa applied for a scholarship program that we award around December each year, and was successful. And she had art lessons as a result of that. And for the last 3 years, she's been submitting work as part of our tenant art show. Usually the subject is Lulu, getting my L's mixed up, but usually the subject's Lulu, and her art is brilliant. So investing in people, not just investing in property. And I'm very passionate about that. And we can scale up. The community housing sector can be the conduit between the government and the private sector. This is quite a simple slide I produced about. I've been in Australia 17 years now, originally from London, and I produced this slide almost when I came off the plane. Because what I observed 17 years ago was everyone, the general paraphrasing, many people I bumped into thought government was bad, the private sector was good, and what's the not-for-profit sector? What's the community housing sector? People didn't really even know what it was. And I've been sort of communicating this sort of information for a long time, which is around the community housing sector is the perfect conduit between the private sector and government. It's where you can build in design quality, you can build a brief, you can talk about the value other than monetary value and what you're trying to achieve. So you can get the relationships, the funding, the capacity building, and sometimes the underwriting of the outcome, as the other speakers have outlined. You can get that right, and then you can go to the market, because you need to involve the private sector to scale up the opportunity to bring in more money, to layer in the finance. But often I see that the private sector leads, or the government goes directly to the private sector, and the people who could form the legacy, which is the CHPs in the middle, are bolted onto the deal at the end in some form. And the best that part of the stream can do, they can deliver it very tightly and hopefully manage the tenancies well and make a minor surplus. It's missing the opportunity of what the community housing sector could provide for Australia. So I think, but the partnering, the contractual relationship, the risk transfer, and the scaling of the outcomes, they're all brilliant things for the private sector, brilliant private sector organisations to get involved in. But I think it could almost be a seesaw as well here. I think getting the time right on this. Conversely, some of the comments I made in questions and stuff during the course of the conference, we also need to just celebrate that the money's there, get on with it, build things, and incrementally adjust the processes, and not scare the government to not invest more. Because as we've heard even this morning, this is probably a 40-year journey of investment that needs to happen to correct the mismatch of lack of investment since the 1970s or even before. This is, the tower on the left is like just a quick, simple expression of what HAF1 was. HAF1 was, concessional loans of around 10%, private equity or CHP equity of about 20%, and then senior debt from Housing Australia, which was measured really by what the availability payments needed to pay. So that was generally the capital stack that got funded, and there's different levels of price points within that. On the right is one example, just one, and I'm happy to talk to my community housing colleagues or others, but one stack which I'm advocating for strongly, especially when the likely availability payment may go as low as $12,000. We hear, in whispers around rooms. So, and where that impacts quality and design, as the rest of the panel have been saying, this will be potentially a race to the cheapest submissions rather than the best submissions. So what we're sort of looking at, but we do hear the positive that there may be a 20% concessional loan component, which is money which goes in from the federal government, which doesn't need to be paid back during the course of the 25 years, just needs to be counted for the end. So in a way, it's sort of semi-free money for the period. So the fact that there's 20% concessional loan is really good. But we think, and I think, the ability to layer funding between the state governments and federal governments, so that state governments invest with community housing providers, and maybe we have a stack where the loan supportable from the black segment is based on the availability payment, and then we work with state governments to layer in some of their funding, so the homes can be held in perpetuity and owned by a mixture of the community housing provider and the state government, but managed by the community housing provider. And then this isn't an advert, but this is just some of the things a relatively small organisation in the scheme of things like Link Wentworth's been doing. We've got 8 HAF projects underway. They are extraordinarily complicated in terms of their funding, but I don't say that very often because I'm just pushed we're very grateful and it's good, let's do more. But we've got 4 of them on site. So and they're beautiful. So I agree. These are beautiful homes. I am passionate about delivering beautiful homes that people are proud of in great locations. So we've got developments in Camaray, which are focused on 12 older women who are homeless or at risk of homelessness or who have experienced domestic violence. We've got a brilliant scheme in Rouse Hill Town Centre on the Metro. Again, 33 homes for vulnerable people who require social housing. A brilliant development, my favourite, if I'm allowed a favourite, an adaptive reuse of a medical centre which has been empty for about 4 or 5 years in Manly, which will be 37 homes primarily for women escaping domestic violence or long-term homelessness. Another small development of 10 homes where we bought the site, which was 1 social housing unit, which will be 10. So a huge uplift, again, for all social housing. We've got 4 larger sites which are going on site next year, and we're going through the procurement process. A round 2 project, the top left, in Western Sydney for 63 homes. A beautiful building designed by SJB at Macquarie Park, Lachlan's Line, 135 homes. Thornley, again, 7 social housing units, becoming 48 seniors dwellings for social housing. And then Lane Cove North, a partnership with Homes New South Wales in Lane Cove, again, a very expensive suburb. We've got the same factor, same problem in nearly all our locations now. Build cost is more than value. So again, there is an opportunity for community housing providers to step up because a bit of the Keynesian economic theory, we need to get the construction industry and residential starts moving. And we're more appealing than we've ever been before because of builders wanting to build, and us having a longer term view. We're not selling these homes. So if we're building quality and it's 100%, 110% of value, well, we'll do that, because it's serving the communities we serve in the right locations. And if we're building in Blacktown and it's more expensive than it's worth, well, we're holding the asset for a long time. We're also doing crisis accommodation and youth forers, and we're only able to do these projects because we have a development team that links in with external architects and external project managers. We're doing this where we've got a very minor role post-completion. We're doing this because it's urgently needed in the communities we serve, and for the first time in a long time, there's money available to fund it. So it's not just the big, beautiful projects. These are probably the most important projects that we're doing within our portfolio, which totals up just the things we're building ourselves to 516 homes. I've got the few-minute thing. I've got a few more slides just to run through. It's mentioned a few times by different speakers. I was involved in a big urban renewal project in London, which still ranks as my favourite ever job. I love being at Link Wentworth. I've been here for 12 years. But Stonebridge was an amazing estate renewal project with 6,000 people living in it. The prospect of working in Waterloo with the community excites me so much. I can't even describe how excited I am by it. but also by working with Birribee Housing, an Aboriginal provider, who it's two-way the learning. I feel embarrassed sometimes because often it's about us providing them with support, but it's actually them providing us with support as well. They provide us with shed loads of information, with a license to operate, and friendship and sharing knowledge. So it's a two-way knowledge share. But also, we are committed to making sure they grow pretty substantially over the short term and the long term, because it is important that we empower Aboriginal owned and controlled entities. And I have a vision that Birribee will be one of the biggest community housing providers in Australia, and certainly in New South Wales, because they've got that licence and they've got the leadership. But also, we're reliant on, a big developer at this moment in time. So we're working with one of the best. We're working with Stockland, and they've been a brilliant partner. One of the problem with this procurement, it's been 3 years worth of procurement to get to the agreed sign of us being the preferred proponent. But also the plus side is it took 3 years of procurement. So we know each other really well, and we're going into this really, really positively. Last couple of slides. People are moving directly into brand new homes.
Pretty quickly now, Andrew, if we could.
Yeah, people are moving directly into beautiful new homes, and they don't come much more beautiful than the Mirvac delivered Metro Quarter above the Waterloo station, which is a stunning development. So 70 households will be directly moving in here who are just who are thrilled. And I've had the privilege and pleasure to meet about 55 of those households that are moving in. And there's a lot of excitement about people moving in. The young girl in the middle of the photo, I don't know her name yet, but her family, when they saw the home they were moving into, the daughter was refusing to leave. She didn't want to go back to her old home. She wanted to move in that day. Unfortunately, she had to go home, but she'll be moving in a couple of weeks' time, so we're really looking forward to that. But this development in its first phase will deliver 1,100 new social housing homes and about 500 affordable. And last slide. It's not just about providing homes, it is about building futures and our role in communities. So I think the story around how do community housing providers continue to step up is so important. It's not just about structures, it's about outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And I'm bubbling with questions myself, and synergies and maybe some disjunctures at different times, but I'm going to park those for now and throw to you, because you've probably been storing up questions, whether for Mark or David, or then for Stephen or Andrew. So who wants to kick us off with this batch of questions? Down the front here.
Hi, thank you so much for this session. My name is Adam McAnulty from the City of Sydney. And just really want to emphasise your point, Rachel, about the importance of lived experience in these conversations, because too often we can forget that these are existing communities that have been around for decades, and certainly in the case of Waterloo, 40, 50 years, and too often those views and the impact can be overlooked. So I did have a design-related question, but perhaps I can be cheeky and add a second one, and that is, in terms of lessons learned from renewal projects, what are some lessons in terms of mitigating or completely removing the harm to these existing communities who are displaced, essentially, or relocated elsewhere? And removing them from those really strong social bonds that many share with each other. But my first question really was design related. When we think about socially mixed communities of private, social, affordable, and within that private, you could very well have people experiencing rental stress and the like. But thinking about design, how can design respond to those to the differences in people's access to material resources? So, I use the example of social housing, residents living in poverty after housing costs. So how can design respond to these differences to build social cohesion?
So I'm now juggling with which order should we do these in, and we're just before lunch, so a little cheekiness might be, I think, permissible in this case. But perhaps let's talk about the existing communities first and then go to the design question. Does anyone want to start us off? Andrew, you're looking like you're...
I think things I was involved in London and things I see now, one of the biggest challenges on urban renewal and renewal of public housing is where do people move first? And I think the planning process to allow some early buildings in the immediate area, so that it's part of the consultation around a 2 or 3 year planning process and consultation process. Get some developments in the immediate vicinity going so you don't dislocate the community. So anyone who wants to move nearby and stay with the same GP, the same school, the same social network, that there are those opportunities. I think Homes New South Wales, for a mixture of luck and good judgment and forward planning, that's what we've got at Waterloo. We've got City West, the building, have just opened a stunning building called Baronia in Waterloo, and then the Waterloo Metro Station. So that allows about 2/3 of the people who are moving in the first phase to move directly within the immediate neighbourhood to a brand new home. And one of the things I've learned is we need to make sure we tell that story to the remaining residents, that how well people have been treated. We have to treat them really well. The communication, getting it right, the move process, the disconnection of services, the reconnection of services, you know, hanging the TV on the wall and making sure the grab rails are right. We need to make sure that those first moves go as well as the last moves, but that is our showcase. If people have promised a lot, those people will be an advert for us, or they will be telling everyone it didn't go well. And then many people will want to use that opportunity to say, I want to live with my daughter in the North Coast, or I want to move to a different part of Sydney or New South Wales. So to give people that opportunity because they've got choice, because government and the consortium want them to find an alternative home. So I think it's to listen to people about what their first preference is, and ideally have some homes in the immediate vicinity that are brand new that people can move to, Adam. That would be my tips.
And David, perhaps I might ask you also from the Victorian experience, or at least the Melbourne experience, for the ground lease models, for the projects that are up and running, or even the projects that are in the design and planning stages, how are things happening there? How are the existing communities being engaged, connected with, treated through that process?
Yeah, look, I mean, it ends up in the media because it'll just take one person to suddenly set off and create a story. I think you have to have the big picture view, and I think, you know, Victorian government's done that quite well, that transition. They've created certainty around saying this is where you'll go, but this is what you're coming back to. And so I think in balance, they've done a good job. And this is me looking kind of in as an architect on that. But I think the key thing is about dignity. And I think you're creating homes that give people the dignity they deserve, like we all do. And so you don't want to create the stigmas around, you know, and that's why tenure blind is actually a really good strategy in principle. It's often hard to deliver in a design sense, and you've got to be careful about that. But the project I showed from Ground Lease Model 2, which was that purple building with the bricks down the bottom, that's actually part of the Women's Property Initiative. And the quality of housing that is being delivered on that particular site is really good. You're dealing with one of Australia's best architects in Kirsten Thompson. You're dealing with a building layout that's got single-loaded corridors, which in Melbourne is rare. Usually they're double-loaded because of the yield they can get out of that. And so that. So
for the non-architects in the room, yes. Single-loaded, double-loaded. Can you do code for us?
So most hotel rooms, you walk into, they're double-loaded. So you go down a corridor, room, off on the sides. Whereas a single-loaded, which is more likely to be in New South Wales, because you've got better standards around, Set 65 and the work that was done to create good apartments through that process and that policy. Whereas here, in Victoria, we don't have that same level of quality to our apartments. So to actually get a single-loaded corridor, which allows cross-ventilation through your apartments, and effectively it's the way that building performs, and it gets back to the fact that, the biggest cost in any building project is the operating cost, which is 85%. And if you put in design, it's usually 0.3 to 0.5. So that 0.3 to 0.5 can have a significant impact on that 85%. And that's a really critical connection that's not often discussed in the cut and thrust of procurement, of going through the bidding with different consortia, and then government actually having the courage to make the right decision, not based on cost alone. And the challenge we find is that we're often not in the room for those discussions around cost. We're siloed off from that conversation. So when there's discussion around how do we value manage your project because your bid's coming in too high, we don't have line of sight to that. And if we did, we might actually be able to add value.
And I'm afraid my tired brain has slightly lost track of the design question. So could you just very succinctly, Adam, reframe that one? And Mark, I might put you on notice that I might throw this one to start off with to you.
Given the social mixed developments really will, given they will house people who have differing access to material resources with a good portion potentially living in poverty after housing costs, how can design respond to those challenges and build social cohesion?
Thanks.
Look, I think there's a similarity in the response and to a degree David's comments previously on choice. I think access is of prime importance. The opportunity to give diversity of product into these dwellings, these developments that we're working on is critical. I think the access provided to the residents beyond that is predicated on location of the site and choice and connection to those community benefits. And I think, certainly from the Smith Street development that I put forward earlier, the contemplation around the appropriate siting of these developments relevant to services and connected into community services is really important, so that choice of selected sites, selected opportunities at the beginning is really important. Andrew's
got a quick comment, but I am going to...
Just add a little more, Adam. I think what's brilliant as well is the consortia, the ethos of the consortia is so important, not as well as the design, because with Waterloo as a good example, if every square metre is to yield the highest dollar return, it will probably not serve the community. Whereas in this case, there is a consciousness around we have to look at the demographic of the people who are going to live in the area and make sure that the community facilities and the shops and the services serve all of the people. So it's not just to service the 50% of the people who will be buying their apartments, and that's been very much a part of the process there. So making sure there's an anchor there in, for instance, Oz Harvest. How do we keep that facility there? How do we grow that facility for a wider area, rather than just think, okay, we want a massive Woolies? So it's about the design, but also about the intent.
And I might even, Stephen, bring you into the discussion here. I know you're thinking, what is she doing? Thinking more from some of the comments that David and others have made about as costs escalate on a project, it's some of the community-facing things or some of the things that really support tenants that might be stripped away from a project. Has that been something that you've had to grapple with in your role as investment and financing, but also public benefit in mind, and how have you grappled with it?
Yeah, look, thanks. Look, absolutely we have. We're very focused on the public benefit being delivered by these projects. These are not investments as such. This is about delivering, capacity into the community in the region. So I think in terms of, how does it get valued, I think there's a lot of different views on that. But certainly from our involvement and being, pretty transparent, I think, for a lot of these projects to proceed, it's all around how much does the state government really want to support them, because they don't, they don't stand alone. They'll need operating subsidies, and it's I think it's really convincing the state government around what's the benefit of that, because ultimately they're the ones putting their hand in their pocket. Like on this Cairns project, they're far and away the majority of the revenue to the project. So they're the ones that really need to be convinced around what the benefits they bring, and I think some of those health benefits, obviously mental health issues, physical health issues, etc., are things that they're very wary of, because not wary of, but very conscious of, because ultimately they're costs that they also bear. So things around building that cost benefit analysis. I mean, it sounds pretty brutal just saying, well, somebody's health is a cost benefit analysis, but that's the reality of state government. And the federal government, they've got a budget. It's got lots of
big numbers with it.
Big numbers, and everybody wants a bit more. So it's really around trying to pull as much of that towards these projects as possible.
Okay, we've got one here. And then the gentleman next, so it looks like you're negotiating as to who will go first, and then we've had another one here. So we'll probably get snappier with our questions and our answers, and I might not everyone might have the opportunity on the panel to respond to each. So I'll do my best to direct things.
Great panel conversation, great to be here. Simone Parsons from Bridge Housing. What I'm struck by with what we've seen in the designs is how many of them are, moderate in height, moderate in number of stories. What can you tell us about, what have we learned about thriving communities in tower blocks, and are we designing for future? So I'm thinking of what's happening in Victoria. We've had it in New South Wales as well, but HAF is pushing us also into a position where we're looking at volume, and so density and mixed tenure in tower settings is going to continue to be part of the housing environment. Any thoughts?
Great. And David, I might put you on the hot spot again around that one. Towers is a word in Victoria at the moment that brings a lot of different perspectives and emotions around it, but let's focus on the new build towers and what they could potentially, how they can work for communities and tenants.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the housing that we've got, say, for example, in Flemington in Victoria, so if you're coming in on the freeway from the airport, because we don't have a rail line yet, still waiting, out to the airport, you'll notice in Flemington there's high-rise housing there that's been there since 1957. So that's a year after Melbourne Olympics. And that is coming down because of different issues associated with current standards in terms of building quality, but also safety, and also even issues like seismic movement. And that's often an issue that's not properly discussed, because things have changed over time. Since 1957, the controls that are there to regulate and keep us safe in our dwellings is really critical. So we've noticed that it's really important to move to a model where the scale of the housing allows connection back to the street, and that's a really important urban design consideration, that there's not that sense of disconnect in a modernist building, going back to the work of Le Corbusier and his notion that you could solve everything by just throwing up these tower blocks. It doesn't necessarily lead to great social interaction and behaviours. And so getting it down to a more, I would say, European scale in the order of 6 to 8 stories often works best, because you've still got eyes on the street. The cohort itself gets to mix and integrate. You can break it down into smaller components where security can be afforded to certain parts of that building rather than it just being vertical and then out on that particular floor. So you can control it in a better manner. So there's a number of different reasons why it's good. Even audio, in terms of audio, you can hear what's happening at a street level of conversation if you're not going too high. So there's a number of design reasons why there's a shift into that scale, and I think it's far better for the occupants and the residents who live there.
Okay, I think that there's probably more views on that on the panel, but I'm going to be a mean facilitator and mean to the panel perhaps, but generous to our people who are joining us. So for the gentleman next to, or just close to...
No problem. I'll be quickly. My name's Carl. I'm planner/researcher at Western Sydney Uni. 3 points. I'm just interested in how can tenants get involved in the design from the start, from these projects, possible opportunities for equity introduced as the housing cooperative sort of model, and also tenant management to drive down some of those ongoing maintenance costs.
Okay, I can see I've got myself into trouble by accepting a 2-part question, and now we've moved into a 3-part question. So actually, let's start firstly with the tenants in design component. Mark, maybe have you?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's a tricky one for tenants in terms of whether tenants are known, whether the community housing provider has a clear understanding of and direction on the tenants. I think, but there is most certainly, if with clarity in that regard, there is most certainly an opportunity for a stakeholder engagement process to fit into the
procurement process. We've talked a number of projects, including the one I spoke to in Smith Street, this long, slow burn procurement process to get to the position where you're decanting and you're actually commencing with the development. So there certainly is opportunities. There is obviously a very careful and strategic process of both town halling and then with individual stakeholder groups within that, filtering through inputs and then having an opportunity in the development of the design process to feed back that loop of stakeholder engagement back in. But there certainly is an opportunity, and it's one I think in the slower procurement process it should be investigated.
And in the interest of time, I might hold over the question on co-ops and encourage you to chat to someone on the panel over lunch. The gentleman a few rows back, purple shirt. We can have a microphone there, or if you don't mind, just projecting.
Thank you very much for a really interesting panel. Just a bit of question about the ground lease model. I mean, I've discussed land lease before. Is just wondering about the definitions, like ground lease, land lease. I guess from that, is there good and bad ground lease? And I guess, but the other thing is from the discussions I've had that there can be issues with financing, particularly private financing around these kinds of models. So. How do you, what kind of models work in terms of those ground or land lease arrangements?
A ground lease v land lease, is it just different language?
I've only worked on ground lease, and effectively it's a term that was coined to demonstrate the fact that government retains ownership of its land. That's how I understand it. As I said before, it's very similar. It's effectively a public-private partnership, and I think PPPs are under scrutiny, especially in the UK. So since 2018, there's been a considerable amount of, change in behaviour and appetite from within government to pursue PPPs in the UK because they're not seen to be delivering value to the public in terms of dollars spent. And they basically have stopped them in Scotland as well. And I mean, I've seen them with schools and they don't necessarily always end up being a great outcome. I think the traditional procurement method for a school is best served by not going down that route of a PPP, but they're really good when it comes to big kind of projects like hospitals, and the Royal Children's Hospital fell into that case. But
so I might put a pin in the PPPs because we could have a whole other panel on that. I think that from what I understand, the land lease, ground lease is just a language difference rather than a difference in model. I might, Stephen, bring you when the dollars are talked about. I think your obvious initial discussion point. So in terms of is the finance sector less interested in investing in ground lease models as far as you're aware? You might not have been working on those in Northern Australia?
Yeah, look, it's a different structure in the sense that no bank, no financier is going to want to enforce on a project. So the fact that it's a ground lease, the idea whether you've got security over the land or you don't have security over the land is sort of irrelevant. It's really around the cash flow, and that's why these operating subsidies and stuff are so critical, because financiers want to get their money back and they want to get it through getting paid every quarter in line with the schedule, not through trying to enforce on a project. And that's something we experience all the time. I mean, we're never going to enforce on this project in Cairns and kick 600 plus social and affordable housing tenants out to sell the building, which we can't sell anyway. So it's really around that security of cash flow, and that's where I think it really comes down to state government, federal government, looking at the conditions of the various leases, and that's why it's really important around the CHPs. I mean, you need to have confidence they know how to manage the tenancies. If people are behind, what do they do and stuff, so that money comes in regularly to make the payments. So whether it's a ground lease or you've got security over it, doesn't really make that much difference at a practical level.
Okay, we've probably got time for one quick final question. One more at the back.
Thank you. I'll be super quick again. My name is Leah, by the way. I'm from Housing Choices. This is a bit of a hairy question, I guess, or a bit of a controversial one towards the end for David. Do you think architects have failed to advocate for design, given how many badly designed buildings we have?
Wow, that is a bit of a doozy. David, if you're a brave man, jump on in.
I'm not sure I accept the premise yet. It was raised in one of the workshops the other day that there's only 95%. Adam Haddo, who's the president of the Australian Institute of Architects, says only 95% of architects are not involved in housing, right? So only 5% are, and it's a really small part of that. Who judges what's quality? That's another question. But I think there's three key things that sit behind good design, which is firmness, as in the structural capability of that building, commodity, how fit for purpose is it, and also delight, and is it a joy to live in? And that goes back to 100 BC with Vitruvius, who said those three things make a good building. And design, you can point fingers in any of this and blame certain groups, but the architects that we work with, and hopefully those slides were demonstrating that is good design, that there are some architects out there who are doing some really good work. It just gets back to the procurement model, and are they given a clear line of communication back to the client? And is that client good in the first place? Is government a good client? And sometimes it's not, because it's not always sure what it wants. And so when it came down to tenure blindness or tenure equity, government, when we were working on the ground lease model 1, really struggled to articulate what that looks like. Does it mean we put, the social housing over here and the market component there, or do we do it by floors? It's that whole notion of people referring to it as salt and pepper, and then it turned into salt and pepper shakers because they were going to be in different groups. So if the client understands what they want and what their cohort needs, which gets back to community housing providers, if everyone at the table has the same vested interest, it can be a great project, and the architecture will be there for a long, long time. And when it gets handed back to government after 40 years, if the quality has been built into that project from not just day one of construction, but in the brief, then that's doing a really positive thing for the community, but also for the state.
Great, thank you, David. And I think we might wrap it there. I think, was it Petruchus you were quoting? I think if we're...
Vitruvius, yeah.
Petruvius. If we're going back to the Greeks and the Romans, I think that's a good point to leave it at today. But encourage you to chat over lunch more about this, and then also to, of course, join us for the final plenary session in the main room after lunch, where there'll be a panel doing basically a wrap up and a bit of a state of the nation of where we're at and where we need to be going. So looking forward to seeing you there. Grab yourself some food and coffee and tea and whatever your beverage of choice is, and see you shortly.